You might want to reconsider who you're talking to, because that's my daughter." The restaurant fell silent as the billionaire stepped from the shadows, his words cutting through the chaos like lightning. "What just unfolded? Where are you watching from today? New York, Lagos, London? Drop your city in the comments below." At first glance, she appeared to be just another black server, brutally degraded by an entitled socialite in an upscale restaurant. But nobody anticipated the shocking revelation from the powerful figure watching from the wings. Tonight's narrative transcends mere drama. It's a stark reminder about privilege, power, and human dignity. What would your response have been in her position? Stay until the end, because what begins as a moment of devastating public disgrace transforms into an extraordinary twist of justice that will leave you speechless. The Gilded Rose restaurant towered like a beacon in downtown Chicago's elite district, its gleaming brass and mahogany facade reflecting the amber glow of twilight. Within its walls, the main dining room sparkled like a scene from another era. Golden light cascaded from ornate fixtures, suspended like stars above the pristine white tablecloths, casting dancing shadows across the sterling silverware below. The atmosphere was rich with the aroma of premium steaks, aged whiskey, and refined luxury. This was where time seemed suspended, where every murmur carried the weight of influence and power. But moving gracefully through this world of designer suits and investment conversations was someone who belonged more than any patron could imagine, yet appeared to belong least of all. Leola James glided between tables with the fluid precision of a trained performer. At 25, she carried herself with a poise that spoke of wisdom beyond her years. Her warm brown skin caught the restaurant's golden ambiance like silk, and her dark eyes, though weary from endless hours, still held an inner fire. She wore the establishment's crisp black and white uniform with quiet dignity, despite the fabric clinging from a grueling double shift. Her feet ached in the required heels, and every step sent jolts through her legs, but her composure never wavered. The Gilded Rose demanded absolute perfection, and Leola delivered it without fail. Tray after tray, smile after smile, she existed in plain sight yet remained invisible to most guests. Though they certainly noticed her beauty, they always did. What none of them realized, what none could have suspected, was that Leola didn't need this position. She didn't require the modest wages, the burning feet, or the endless nights cleaning up after Chicago's elite. She was the daughter of Chester Ray, a real estate empire builder whose properties stretched across the Midwest like monuments of glass and steel. She had never boasted about her heritage, never once let it slip. To her colleagues, she was simply Leola, the one who always volunteered for the late shifts, who covered for sick teammates, who never cut corners. She had insisted on using her mother's maiden name, had pleaded with her father not to interfere. Though Chester had winced at the thought of his daughter serving people who would never recognize her true worth, he had honored her wishes with one condition: he would always be nearby, watching from the shadows. Leola hadn't chosen this path to prove anything to others. It wasn't rebellion, it was revelation. She wanted to experience the world without filters, to understand how people treated someone they considered insignificant. She wanted to earn something genuine. Her hands, though professionally manicured, were accustomed to hard work. Her heart, though filled with dreams, remained grounded in purpose. So tonight, like every other, she moved among the privileged, her smile unwavering, her posture perfect, her pride buried beneath layers of professionalism. Across the room, a string quartet played soft melodies, barely audible beneath the gentle hum of conversations and occasional bursts of laughter too loud for such refined surroundings. Leola approached table 7, where an elderly couple nodded approvingly at the appetizers she had just delivered. "Magnificent," the woman said, dabbing her lips with fine linen. "Please give our compliments to the chef." Leola bowed slightly, and promised she would. These moments of simple kindness made the exhausting nights bearable. Small gestures of humanity, rare though they were, still never bridged the invisible divide. She was always the girl, or young lady, or worse, you there never Leola. Back at the service station, she refilled water glasses with the practiced rhythm of someone who had learned to move without conscious thought. Her colleague Alvin passed behind her with an encouraging nod. "Almost finished," he whispered. "Still got 90 minutes, she replied with a tired smile. "But who's counting?" The friendly banter helped. It reminded her she wasn't truly alone. Yet even surrounded by familiar faces, there was an inherent solitude to the role, an invisible barrier between those who served and those who were served. Leola understood this better than anyone, having lived on both sides of that divide. The clock approached 9:30. The pace intensified as new reservations arrived. Familiar names from society pages, local celebrities, tech moguls, political donors. Leola checked the seating chart again, smoothing a wrinkle from her apron. Her next assignment was in the premium section, an area typically reserved for VIPs. A flutter of anticipation passed through her, not because of whom she would serve, but how she would serve them. To her, every table was a stage, every gesture an opportunity to perfect her craft. She lived for the details, how the silverware aligned, how the crystal caught the light, how to place a dish without the slightest sound. Then the energy in the room shifted, subtle like a change in atmospheric pressure. The hostess at the entrance straightened. A ripple of murmurs ran through the nearby staff. Leola turned and saw her, a statuesque blonde in a form-fitting scarlet dress, diamonds gleaming at her throat and wrists, heels striking the polished floor like a slow, deliberate drumbeat. Glenda Ruth, a name Leola recognized from gossip columns and whispered staff conversations, social media influencer, socialite, and notorious troublemaker. Her reputation preceded her like a warning, a trail of rudeness, entitlement, and headlines built more on spectacle than substance. She didn't simply enter a room. She claimed it as though her presence alone demanded submission. Glenda barely acknowledged the hostess as she was escorted to the prime corner table. She settled into her chair with calculated precision, immediately pulling out her phone before even adjusting her position. Her fingers danced across the screen, her gaze never lifting. Leola drew a quiet breath, steadied her tray, and approached the table. "This is just another guest," she reminded herself. "Another order, another opportunity to do her job with excellence." But something in her stomach tightened, a premonition she couldn't quite shake. She approached with her warmest professional tone, the same voice that had soothed difficult customers and charmed the most demanding clients. "Good evening, ma'am. Welcome to the Gilded Rose. May I start you with something to drink?" Her voice was steady, professional. She stood tall despite the fatigue that pulled at her shoulders. Glenda didn't look up. "Champagne, the expensive kind. And make it fast. I don't have all night." The words weren't sharp. They were dismissive, casual, as though Leola were merely part of the furniture. She flicked her hand in a shooing gesture, her attention never leaving her phone screen. Leola paused for the briefest moment, then nodded. "Of course, ma'am," and turned to retrieve the drink. But something about that interaction, the chill in Glenda's tone, the way she couldn't be bothered to make eye contact, lodged itself in Leola's chest. It was subtle but unmistakable, the same reminder that echoed through places like this every night. No matter how flawlessly you performed your role, some people only saw the uniform, never the person wearing it. As the quartet continued playing, and wine continued flowing, and laughter continued swirling beneath the chandeliers, Leola carried a crystal flute of champagne back to table 7, unaware that within minutes, everything would change, not just for her but for everyone watching. Glenda Ruth sat like a queen holding court over her digital kingdom. Her posture was perfect, her fingers commanding her phone screen, with the authority of someone accustomed to having the world respond to her every whim. The soft glow of her device illuminated her sharp cheekbones, and her diamond jewelry sparkled with each slight movement, catching the chandelier light as if demanding constant applause. She didn't need to look up. In her mind, the world, this restaurant, this very air existed solely to accommodate her presence. She wasn't rude in the traditional sense. She was dismissive in a way that didn't require words, because her silence spoke volumes. Leola approached with steady hands and quiet grace, balancing a silver tray with a single champagne flute, tiny bubbles rising like liquid starlight. She reached the table and gently placed the drink down on the pristine tablecloth, positioning it precisely to the right of Glenda's untouched silverware. "Here you are, ma'am," she said softly, her voice calm and practiced. But just as she began to step back, Glenda, eyes still glued to her phone, reached carelessly for the glass without looking. Her hand struck the stem, and in an instant the champagne toppled. The cold liquid splashed across the table, streamed over the polished surface, and cascaded directly onto Leola's uniform. Her blouse clung immediately to her skin, the chill shocking her system. A collective gasp rose from nearby tables like the sharp intake before thunder. The string quartet faltered for just a beat, barely noticeable, but enough to mark the shift in atmosphere. Glenda blinked, finally looking up. Her blue eyes narrowed not with concern, but with annoyance, as though she were the one who had been wronged. "Oh, for crying out loud," she snapped, her voice slicing through the restaurant's refined murmur. "Can't you do anything right?" The words hit like a physical blow. Heads turned throughout the dining room. A woman wearing pearls at the adjacent table froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. A man across the room lowered his wineglass, his expression troubled. Leola stood frozen, her clothes damp and clinging, the cold seeping through to her skin. But worse than the physical discomfort was the weight of every eye now focused on her, the heat of humiliation rising beneath her professional mask. Still, she kept her voice level. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am. Let me get you another drink immediately." Glenda raised her hand as if swatting away an insect. "Do they hire just anyone here?" she said with a sneer, leaning back in her chair with theatrical disgust. "Honestly, you're a walking catastrophe. I come to this establishment for excellence, not incompetence." Her voice rang out with calculated volume, deliberately projected for maximum impact, and she was getting the audience she craved. Some guests looked away uncomfortably, pretending not to hear. Others didn't bother hiding their attention. A young woman discreetly angled her phone, camera app open. Leola knelt slightly, dabbing at the spill with napkins from the bread plate. Her movements were mechanical, her face composed. "I'll clean this up right away," she said, eyes downcast, not from shame, but because she refused to meet the gaze of someone who found joy in cruelty. "And I'll have a fresh glass brought over immediately. No charge." Glenda laughed, a sharp, delighted sound that cut through the restaurant's murmur like breaking glass. "Oh, how generous of you. No charge. As if that makes up for your mess. Listen, sweetheart. Girls like you don't belong in places like this. You're clearly out of your league. Maybe stick to fast food or, what's the term? Basic service. This establishment is above your level." The insult wasn't loud, but it was razor sharp, and it sliced clean through Leola's restraint. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply rose slowly, standing in her damp uniform with dignity, radiating from every inch of her being. Her eyes met Glenda's, calm, clear, and far more powerful than rage. "Yes, ma'am. I'll have that drink replaced right away," she repeated, and turned to walk back toward the kitchen. But Glenda wasn't finished. She reached for a glass of red wine that had just been placed on her table, part of her dinner order. With a calculated flick of her wrist, She hurled the contents toward Leola's retreating figure. The stemware clinked sharply as it hit the floor, the wine exploding across Leola's back and skirt like crimson paint on canvas. A collective groan rose from the dining room. Someone audibly gasped. The wine ran in dark rivulets down her back, soaking into the hem of her apron, staining the pristine marble tiles beneath her feet. Glenda burst into delighted laughter, a high-pitched, triumphant cackle. "Maybe that will teach you to pay attention," she called out, still seated, still smirking, her voice echoing with satisfaction as she dared anyone to challenge her. Leola stopped in place. Her hands trembled, not from fear, not entirely from shock, but from the sheer restraint it took to keep standing. For a brief moment, she stared straight ahead, her back to Glenda, the hum of the dining room swirling around her like static. Then she inhaled deeply, steadily, and continued walking, her head held high. No one could say she stormed off. She didn't rush. She didn't crumble. She carried her wine-soaked uniform like armor. Back at the service station, Alvin stared at her with wide eyes. "What the hell just happened?" he whispered. But Leola said nothing. She simply hung her soiled towel on the counter, shoulders square, and reached for a fresh cloth. Behind her the kitchen door swung open, and someone muttered, "That woman's completely unhinged." Phones buzzed, screens lit up. Someone was already uploading video clips. Within moments, it would be everywhere. Out in the dining hall, Glenda returned to her seat, lips pursed in satisfaction, chatting with a friend who had just arrived. "Honestly," she said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "some people just don't belong in places like this. She should be grateful she even has a job here." But something fundamental had shifted. The laughter that once flowed easily now felt forced and uncomfortable. The diners were watching, some in silence, some shaking their heads. A man near the window whispered to his wife, "That girl handled it better than I would have." And in the far corner, behind a frosted glass partition, a tall man in a charcoal suit set down his drink. His silver-touched brows furrowed as his eyes followed Leola's dignified retreat. Because for the first time all evening, Chester Ray wasn't focused on property developments or expansion strategies. He was watching something unfold that was deeply personal, something infuriating. And as he reached into his jacket and signaled for the manager, the atmosphere shifted once more. The storm was about to break. The wine continued to drip from Leola's uniform as she stood by the service station, the back of her blouse clinging to her skin like a damp second layer. Her fingers were curled into her palms, her knuckles pale, but her expression revealed nothing. The sting wasn't from the cold wine or the acidic scent now permeating her clothes. It was from that laughter, that high-pitched, triumphant sound Glenda had released after hurling the drink. It was worse than the liquid itself. It wasn't an accident. It was a declaration, a message to Leola and everyone else watching. "I can do this to you, and you can do nothing in return." But Leola wasn't defenseless, and she knew it. What burned inside her wasn't shame. It was restraint. The kind of restraint required to stand tall while someone attempts to strip away your dignity in public. She didn't cry. She didn't break. She simply grabbed a fresh towel, pressed it against the worst of the red stains now soaking into her white blouse, and told Alvin, "Cover table 7. I'll be back shortly." He nodded, still too shocked to respond properly. From the corner of the kitchen, Chef Claude peeked out, his thick eyebrows raised. "Everything all right?" Leola gave him a tight smile. "Perfect." And then she turned away before anyone could see the faintest shimmer in her eyes. Out in the dining hall, the atmosphere had cracked like fractured glass. The incident had shattered the surface of elegance. Patrons murmured behind linen napkins. Some glanced toward Glenda, who now reclined in her chair with the relaxed satisfaction of someone who believed they had just executed the perfect takedown. She whispered something to her friend, and the two burst into soft giggles, oblivious to the tension brewing around them. But not everyone looked amused. A woman in a navy dress whispered harshly to her husband. She should be thrown out. He nodded grimly, eyes still fixed on Glenda, as though trying to understand what kind of person would find pleasure in such cruelty. Chester Ray hadn't moved from his booth, but his jaw was tight, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had watched every moment, the spilled champagne, the insults, the wine thrown like a weapon, and still he hadn't intervened. Not yet. Leola had asked for space, for autonomy, for the right to walk her own path without the shield of his name. But watching his daughter be humiliated before a room full of strangers was a line he hadn't been prepared to see crossed. Quiet power hummed in his posture. He pressed a button on his phone and murmured a single word into the receiver. Now. At that moment, Daniel, the restaurant's manager, appeared at Glenda's table. His tailored suit was impeccable, but his eyes held unmistakable tension. "Miss Ruth," he said with a strained smile, "Mr. Ray would like to have a word with you." Glenda blinked, mildly annoyed at the interruption. "Who?" she asked, not bothering to mask her irritation. "Chester Ray," Daniel said, "the owner of the Gilded Rose." A beat of silence passed. Then Glenda's eyebrows lifted with interest. "Oh, finally, someone who recognizes quality when he sees it." She stood with deliberate grace, smoothed her scarlet dress over her hips, and followed Daniel, expecting compliments or at worst an apology for having had to endure such substandard service. She never noticed the subtle stares following her, some disapproving, some curious, all aware. Her heels clicked over the marble floor, rhythmic and confident. She didn't see Leola, who had slipped back into the kitchen, rinsing the wine from her hands and wiping down her arms with trembling fingers. As Glenda was led into the private lounge, Chester stood. He was tall, imposing in his charcoal suit, with silver threads at his temples and an expression carved from granite. Glenda's confident stride faltered. Something in his eyes, calm but razor-sharp, made her straighten, then stumble over the words she'd rehearsed. "Ray, I just wanted to say, I know exactly what you did," Chester interrupted, his tone soft but unyielding. "I watched it all." Glenda's lips parted, but the air had thickened around them, and the words caught in her throat. "You came into my restaurant, insulted my staff, assaulted one of them in front of witnesses, and then laughed about it." His voice didn't rise. He didn't need to shout. His authority was in the stillness, in the weight of his gaze. "And that staff member, she's not just an employee, she's my daughter." The sentence dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples across everything. Glenda thought she understood about the evening. Her mouth opened, then shut. Her eyes darted toward the door, toward Daniel, toward anywhere but Chester's steady gaze. "I didn't know," she stammered. "She spilled water." "I saw it," Chester said simply. "She didn't. You did. And when you embarrassed yourself, you blamed her, then you threw wine at her. That's not a mistake, Miss Ruth. That's character." Glenda's cheeks flushed a deep crimson, not from shame. She wasn't accustomed to shame, but from exposure. Her game had played out in front of the wrong audience. Her power here, she realized, was an illusion. Back in the kitchen, Leola stood at the sink, scrubbing at the wine stain on her apron with a mixture of club soda and salt. Alvin appeared behind her. "Hey," he said quietly, "you should see what's happening out there." She didn't respond at first, just kept scrubbing. Then she looked up. "He's confronting her, isn't he?" Alvin nodded slowly. "He's not just confronting her, he's ending her." In the dining hall, guests were whispering, checking their phones. Clips of the incident had already gone viral. Snippets of Glenda's taunts, her wine toss, Leola's quiet walk away. Hashtags were trending. Hash respect. The staff, hash gilded. Rose drama hash. Leola deserved better. The court of public opinion was awake, and it was furious. Glenda stumbled backward a step, her voice cracking under the weight of judgment. "Mr. Ray, please, I didn't mean to." Chester raised a hand, cutting her off. "Your bill is covered. Consider it a parting gift. But you are no longer welcome here." She stared at him as though waiting for the punchline. When it didn't come, she spun on her heel and walked out quickly, flustered, her poise in tatters. Her friends scrambled behind her, wide-eyed and silent. As the doors closed behind them, soft applause broke out in the hall. Not loud, not showy, but steady and sincere. Not for drama, not for spectacle, but for justice. And in the kitchen, Leola let out a single breath, long and slow, not of relief, not yet, but of readiness. Because the next part wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming something even more powerful, her voice. The lounge adjacent to the grand dining hall was quiet, its atmosphere thick with a tension that came not from luxury, but from judgment. Velvet drapes framed the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Chicago's glittering skyline, but even the view felt dim beside the gravity of the moment inside. Glenda Ruth stood frozen just beyond the threshold, her manicured hand still hovering near the back of the leather chair, across from the man who had summoned her. Chester Ray hadn't moved since she entered, but his stillness felt louder than any outburst could have. His gaze didn't waver. It held her in place with the weight of authority, built not just on wealth, but on wisdom earned through decades of storms he'd weathered and won. And now he was here to weather this one, for his daughter. Glenda tried to recover her footing, though the soles of her confidence had already worn thin. "Mr. Ray," she began, voice soft and honeyed, "this is all just a terrible misunderstanding. I came here expecting the five-star experience your restaurant is known for, but instead, you delivered a public assault." Chester cut in, not unkindly, but with absolute clarity. "You humiliated an employee, you mocked her, laughed at her, and when she turned her back, you threw wine on her." His voice was low, yet each syllable struck like a gavel. "You did that, Miss Ruth, and you did it in full view of people who don't forget cruelty easily." Glenda blinked, her throat working to swallow a surge of panic. I didn't realize who she was. I didn't know she was my daughter," Chester asked, rising slowly to his full height, towering over her like a verdict. "That shouldn't matter. No one, no matter who they are, deserves to be treated the way you treated her. Not a server, not a janitor, not a CEO, no one. But since you insist on identities, let me clarify something for you." He stepped closer, his tone unshakable. "Leola James is not just my daughter. She is the soul of this restaurant. She chose to work here to understand people like you, who wield wealth like a weapon. She wanted to learn humility from the ground up, and what you taught her tonight was exactly why that matters." The words landed with finality, and Glenda staggered back a step, as if struck by the weight of her exposure. Her cheeks burned a new shade, no longer the pink of embarrassment, but the red of a mask ripped off too late. She glanced around the room, as though someone, anyone, might interrupt, might save her, but no one came. Only Daniel stood silently near the door, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. There would be no lifeline tonight. "I thought she was just..." Glenda's voice cracked under the strain. "I mean, she looked like she worked here." "She does," Chester replied, "and she worked harder in one evening than most people do in a week. But that didn't give you the right to degrade her. You didn't see a person, Glenda. You saw a uniform, and that's what makes this more than a misunderstanding. That makes it a choice." Outside the lounge, the dining hall was quieter than usual. Guests whispered in low tones, phones still flickering with viral clips and comments scrolling like wildfire. The world was watching. In a far corner, a server showed a guest a headline already surfacing on social media. Socialite drenches server in wine, hotel owner steps in. Beneath it, screenshots of Glenda's smirk, the splash of wine, and Leola's calm, dignified retreat were already being shared thousands of times a minute. The Gilded Rose, known for discretion, was now the stage for a public lesson in humanity. Back in the lounge, Chester stepped away, signaling to Daniel with a nod. Escort Miss Ruth from the premises. She is no longer welcome here. Glenda's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The word blacklisted hadn't been said aloud, but it hung in the air all the same. For someone like her, whose world ran on invitations, appearances, and exclusivity, this exile from a flagship restaurant was more than a social slap. It was a scarlet letter. She turned sharply, clutching her designer purse as though it could anchor her pride. "This isn't over," she muttered, though the words held no threat, only desperation. Daniel didn't respond. He simply opened the door and let her out. At that very moment, Leola emerged from the kitchen. She had changed into a fresh blouse, her hair pulled back tighter now, her face clean, but her eyes still simmering with the echoes of earlier shame. She hadn't asked for justice. She hadn't begged for backup. And yet here it was, justice delivered not by viral mobs or hashtags, but by the one man who truly saw her. She paused when she saw Glenda walking toward her, saw the flush of defeat on her face, the way her chin trembled though she tried to keep it lifted. Glenda couldn't meet her gaze. Her eyes darted away as she passed, heels clicking like a retreat drumbeat. The doors closed behind her, and the hall exhaled. A few guests clapped quietly, unsure if it was appropriate, but driven by a need to release something, relief, perhaps, or admiration. Chester stepped forward into the room, and silence followed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Let it be known," he said, "to no one and everyone. This restaurant respects those who serve with grace. Titles do not matter. Behavior does." He turned then, locking eyes with Leola from across the room. A smile broke through the stern lines of his face, a father's pride, fierce and unapologetic. She gave a nod in return. No words were needed. Between them stood everything that had been tested tonight: trust, dignity, and the choice to rise above. And though the moment belonged to them, the world outside had already taken notice. Social media was ablaze with clips and commentary, influencers spinning think pieces, and former employees of Glenda sharing their own stories. She hadn't just humiliated Leola, she had exposed herself, and the internet, as always, had receipts. But Leola didn't check her phone. She didn't bask in the vindication. She returned to her station, picked up a tray, and moved to refill a guest's glass of wine, this time with the steady hands of someone who knew exactly who she was. She wasn't just the daughter of a billionaire. She was someone who had been tested and hadn't flinched. And now, under the same chandelier light that had seen her soaked in shame, she stood radiant, unwavering, and deeply, unapologetically human. By sunrise, the Gilded Rose's opulent halls had returned to their polished stillness. The clinking glasses, murmured gossip, and trailing echoes of the previous night had all faded into the marble and velvet drapes, except online. On social media, the storm was just beginning. A video taken by a diner, grainy but damning, had captured the entire humiliation of Leola James in under 90 seconds. The sound of Glenda Ruth's voice, sharp and entitled, cut through the footage like a blade. "Maybe that will teach you to pay attention," followed by the unmistakable splash of wine. The video had gone viral within hours. By the time Leola stepped into the staff entrance, just after 9 that morning, it had racked up over 3 million views on Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube combined. Inside the break room, her co-workers greeted her with a silence unlike before. Not awkward, but reverent. Alvin stood first, offering her a fresh coffee. "You sure about being here today?" he asked, voice low. Leola nodded, tying her apron with practiced ease. "Why wouldn't I be?" she said, with a small smile. "The uniform didn't change overnight. Neither did I." Her words were simple, but they settled over the room like a pledge. She wasn't here to revel in attention. She was here to work, as she always had. Yet the restaurant was not the same. Guests now greeted her with newfound warmth, some with cautious respect, others with visible admiration. A middle-aged couple from Detroit stopped her mid-shift just to shake her hand. "We saw the video," the woman whispered, eyes shining. "You handled yourself with such grace. I hope our daughter grows up with your kind of strength." Leola smiled, thanked them, and moved on. She didn't linger in praise. She had tables to serve, glasses to fill, and while the world outside might now see her as the billionaire's daughter, she refused to let that change her. In the lobby, luxury still whispered through every marble panel and crystal lamp, but there was something new in the air, an awareness. Staff members stood a little taller. Guests watched a little more closely, not for scandal but for meaning, because the video hadn't just exposed Glenda Ruth's cruelty. It had reminded people that behind every apron and tray was a human being worthy of respect. The restaurant had received hundreds of emails overnight, some condemning Glenda, others praising Chester Ray, but most were about Leola. Her restraint, her composure, her refusal to sink to the level of someone determined to break her. Upstairs in the executive office, Chester scrolled through the headlines with a sigh. Socialite humiliated server, only to discover her father was the restaurant's billionaire owner. Power meets grace, how one woman's dignity sparked a viral reckoning. He hadn't planned to speak to the press, but a statement had been released anyway, crafted carefully. "At the Gilded Rose we believe that dignity is not a luxury, it's a right. We stand by our staff, always." The words had been his, and he meant them. But what struck him more than any headline was what he saw when he checked the restaurant cameras again. Leola walking through the dining hall, still working, still listening, still pouring coffee with that same thoughtful poise. She had faced a public shaming, been defended by a father she never asked to step in, and become the center of a media firestorm overnight. And yet here she was, unchanged. Not a victim, not a spectacle, just a woman doing her job with unwavering grace. By early afternoon, the backlash against Glenda had hit full force. Her Instagram went dark. Brand partnerships were quietly severed. A former assistant posted a thread recounting years of verbal abuse. A fashion label released a statement denouncing her behavior. The image she'd cultivated, polished, desirable, untouchable, crumbled beneath the weight of her own arrogance. Justice, it seemed, had gone digital, and yet Leola remained untouched by it. She didn't gloat. She didn't post a reaction or tweet a victory. She simply moved forward. When a guest tried to slip her a $100 tip with a wink and the words for going viral, she politely declined. "I'm not a moment," she said. "I'm a person." That line would later be quoted across Twitter, praised as poetic, but to her it was just the truth. She had no interest in becoming a symbol of something she didn't believe in, revenge. What mattered to her was the quiet kind of power, the kind that didn't require an audience. Later that evening, after the dinner rush, Leola stepped onto the balcony behind the service wing. The sky was streaked with the colors of a fading Chicago sunset, coral, gold, violet. She leaned on the railing, letting the breeze cool her skin. The air smelled faintly of the lake and distant music. She thought about how easy it would have been to quit, to retreat into the safety that her father's name could offer. But that would have meant surrendering everything she was building, and she wasn't ready to do that. Not now, not ever. Chester joined her quietly, standing beside her without speaking at first. After a moment he said, "You didn't have to come in today." She glanced at him, then back at the horizon. "Yes, I did," she said, "because if I didn't, then she would have won." He nodded slowly, pride softening the tension in his brow. The world's watching you now, you know. Leola smiled faintly. Let them, as long as they see me for who I am. And that was the truth. She wasn't here for pity or fame or even redemption. She was here for herself, for the version of her who refused to be broken, who chose resilience over revenge, who believed that dignity wasn't something you were born with, it was something you fought to keep. And as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the skyline, Leola Jane stood tall in her uniform, wine stains long washed away, but her resolve etched deeper than ever. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. Not to Glenda, not to strangers online, not even to her father. The world could say what it wanted. She knew who she was. And sometimes, that was the most radical justice of all. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful story of dignity, justice, and quiet strength. What did you think about Leola's choice to keep showing up with grace, even when no one expected her to? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more true-to-life tales that reveal the power of character. Until next time, thank you for watching, and remember, respect speaks louder than status.